You know, some moments don't just happen and fade away. Some moments stick to you, crawl under your skin, and refuse to leave. They whisper in the quietest parts of your mind, reminding you of things you wish you could forget. I never thought one night could change everything, but it did. And the worst part? I should have seen it coming. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere, small, quiet warnings that I brushed aside, convinced they meant nothing. The way his eyes lingered a second too long. The way my heart felt just a little too full when he laughed at my jokes. The way I started dressing up a little more, even when there was no reason to. Harmless, right? Just feelings, thoughts, nothing real. That's what I told myself. But feelings? Thoughts? They have a way of turning into something else when you're not paying attention. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. If you've ever found yourself caught in something you never expected, something messy, something forbidden, you'll understand. It's not always about desire. Sometimes it's about loneliness. Sometimes it's about needing to be seen, to be heard, to feel like you matter. That's what this story is about. And before you judge me, just listen. Because trust me, no one is more ashamed of this than I am. But if I could go back and change what happened, if I could erase that night from my life completely, I don't know if I would. Let's get into it. Subscribe now for more stories that dive deep into the hidden corners of human emotions. Because some secrets deserve to be told. I wasn't unhappy. At least, that's what I told myself. I had a husband, a home, a life that, from the outside, looked complete. People would probably say I had it all. But on the inside, I was lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, but the kind that lingers even when someone is right next to you. The kind that makes you question your worth. The kind that keeps you awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly you became invisible. My husband, David, wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel, he didn't cheat, at least, not in the traditional sense. But he was absent in ways that mattered. Physically, he was there. He'd come home late, eat dinner without saying much, sit in front of the TV, then fall asleep. Emotionally, though, he might as well have been a stranger passing through. We hadn't been intimate in months. Maybe even a year. I don't know when he stopped looking at me. When he stopped reaching for me. I'd ask him about his day, try to pull him into a conversation, but all I'd get were tired nods and distracted responses. Like I was an obligation. Like I was just part of the house, like the furniture or the walls, something he barely noticed anymore. So, I stopped trying. And that's when the silence crept in. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. That's what David told me. Just for a while, he said. He's going through some things. Liam was his son from his first marriage. I had met him a few times before, but only briefly Christmases, the occasional family dinner. He was polite but quiet, always keeping to himself. When he moved in, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time a stepchild had to stay with their parent for a while. I figured we'd barely interact. He was almost 20, independent, probably had his own life to worry about. But looking back now, that was the beginning of everything. The first few weeks were uneventful. Liam kept to himself, mostly staying in his room. David was as absent as ever, working late and falling asleep on the couch. I remember the first night Liam and I were alone in the kitchen. It was late. David hadn't come home yet. I was making tea when Liam walked in, rubbing his eyes, shirtless, his sweatpants hanging loosely around his hips. Couldn't sleep? I asked. He shook his head. I remember the way he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking at me with those quiet, thoughtful eyes. The same shade as his father's, but softer. He was a handsome young man. I never really thought about it before. But that night, standing there under the dim kitchen light, I noticed. I noticed the sharpness of his jawline. The way his hair fell messily over his forehead. The way his lips parted slightly when he was thinking. It was just an observation. Nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself. Days passed. Then weeks. And slowly, something changed. It started small. Subtle. We began talking more. Not forced, awkward conversations, but real ones. He'd ask about my day. He'd laugh at my jokes. He'd listen, actually listen, when I spoke. One night, we ended up watching a movie together. David had, as usual, fallen asleep in his chair. I sat on one side of the couch. Liam sat on the other. Halfway through, I felt him shift. His knee brushed against mine. It was such a small thing. A nothing moment. But I didn't move away. And neither did he. That's when I knew. Something was happening. Something I wasn't ready to admit. I wasn't naive. I knew this was wrong. I was his stepmother. I was married. But I was also human. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. Liam noticed things about me that David never did. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. The way I always added too much sugar to my coffee. The way my shoulders tensed when I was stressed. He noticed. And that did something to me. It made me feel alive. It was raining that night. David was out of town. I was in my room, curled up in bed, listening to the sound of water tapping against the window. Then, footsteps. A soft knock at my door. "Hey, are you awake?" It was Liam. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I sat up, my heart picking up pace. "Yeah, what's wrong?" He stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain, his t-shirt clinging to his body. I couldn't sleep. I nodded, patting the empty space beside me. "Come here." He hesitated for a second. And then, he did. He sat down, close. Too close. I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. And in that silence, with nothing but the sound of the rain outside, I knew. I had already crossed the line. What happened next? I wish I could say I stopped it. I wish I could say I had the strength to walk away. But the truth is, some things, once set in motion, can't be undone. And that night? It was only the beginning. Subscribe now for the next part of the story, because trust me, it only gets deeper from here. That night should have been like any other. I should have told Liam to go back to his room. I should have said goodnight, turned off the lamp, and closed my eyes like nothing was happening. But I didn't. I let him sit there, his body so close to mine that I could feel the warmth radiating off his skin. And in that moment, the house, this cold, lifeless place I had been trapped in for years, felt different. Liam shifted slightly, turning his body toward me, and I felt it again. That pull. That quiet, dangerous current that neither of us dared acknowledge. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "You okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." A pause. A weight in the air. And then, "What about?" He hesitated. I could see the battle happening behind his eyes, the words forming and dying in his throat before he finally spoke. "You seem different," he said. "Like, when I first moved in, you were always so tense. So sad." I blinked. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. "I guess I've been lonely," I admitted. "Marriage isn't always what people think it is." He studied me for a moment, his jaw clenching slightly. "You deserve better." Those 3 words shouldn't have meant anything. They shouldn't have made my chest tighten, my breath hitch. But they did. I turned away, trying to ignore the way my heart pounded in my ears. "Liam, I mean it," he interrupted. "You're amazing. You're funny. You're kind. You're not invisible." That last part hit me like a punch to the stomach. Because that was exactly how I felt. Invisible. Forgotten. But here he was, seeing me in a way my own husband hadn't in years. I let out a small, breathless laugh, trying to lighten the weight of the moment. "You're sweet, Liam. But you don't have to say things just to make me feel better." "I'm not." His voice was firm. And when I turned to look at him, our eyes met. A second too long. A pause that shouldn't have meant anything, but did. And that's when I knew. Something had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. I told myself I was imagining it. That my mind was playing tricks on me, twisting the loneliness into something it wasn't. But the next day, I started noticing things. The way Liam would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he'd stand just a little too close when we talked. The way my stomach would flutter whenever he was near, like I was a teenager again, caught up in some reckless, impossible crush. And the worst part? I didn't want it to stop. I should have pulled away. I should have set boundaries. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years, I felt alive. And that was more dangerous than anything. The shift wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was happening. One night, we were watching a movie in the living room. Nothing romantic, nothing suggestive, just background noise to fill the silence. David was working late. Again. Liam sat next to me, his arm resting on the back of the couch. It was casual, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, our hands brushed. A small touch, barely noticeable. And yet, neither of us moved away. My breath caught in my throat. My skin burned where his fingers had grazed mine, as if his touch had left a mark. I could feel his gaze on me, but I was afraid to meet it. Afraid of what I might see. And then, he shifted, his pinky barely curling around mine. A choice. A question. A line crossed in silence. And I let it happen. Because in that moment, the world felt different. The weight of my marriage, my responsibilities, my guilt, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way my heart raced. The way my skin tingled. The way I suddenly felt wanted again. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment. A mistake. But the truth? The truth was, something had already begun. And even if I tried to ignore it, there was no stopping what was coming next. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the alarm clock casting strange shadows across the room. The sheets felt cold beside me. David had fallen asleep in his office again. And all I could think about was Liam. The way his fingers had barely curled around mine. The way I hadn't pulled away. I kept telling myself it was nothing. A mistake. A fleeting moment that meant more in my mind than it did in reality. But if that were true, why did my heart race every time I replayed it? Why did I feel something shift inside me, something I had buried for years? I wasn't doing anything wrong, was I? I hadn't kissed him. I hadn't touched him in a way that couldn't be explained away. I was just enjoying the attention. That wasn't a crime. That wasn't betrayal. I was human. I was lonely. I was starving for affection in a way I hadn't even realized until he started giving it to me. It wasn't my fault that my husband had forgotten how to love me. It wasn't my fault that Liam had stepped into the empty space he left behind. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the guilt sat heavy in my chest, twisting itself around my ribs like something alive. Because deep down I knew. This wasn't nothing. And it wasn't just in my head. Liam changed after that night. He became more present. More attentive. Not in an obvious way, no, that would have made it easy to ignore. Instead, it was subtle, careful. He lingered a little longer when we talked. He found reasons to be near me, even when he didn't have to be. When I cooked dinner, he stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching me with quiet intensity. When we sat together, his knee would brush mine, his shoulder would touch mine, small, meaningless touches that weren't meaningless at all. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't innocent anymore. It wasn't the way a stepson should look at his father's wife. And I let it happen. I let it all happen. The strangest part? I didn't feel guilty. I should have. I should have felt disgusted with myself. I should have avoided him, pulled away, built a wall between us so high he could never reach me again. But I didn't. Because every touch, every glance, every stolen moment made me feel something I thought I had lost forever. Wanted. Desired. Alive. And wasn't that what every woman wanted? To be seen? To be craved? To feel the warmth of someone's attention wrapping around them like a safety net, holding them in place when they felt like they were slipping away? David hadn't touched me in months. He barely even looked at me anymore. So why did it feel so wrong to let Liam look? To let myself be seen? David noticed nothing. Nothing. And that hurt more than anything. I could have been slipping away in front of his eyes, piece by piece, and he wouldn't have seen it. He would come home late, exhausted, distracted, muttering something about work before heading straight to his office. He didn't see the way I had started doing my hair again. Didn't notice the way I changed my perfume, the way I started wearing dresses around the house instead of my usual leggings and t-shirts. Didn't catch the way my fingers trembled when Liam walked into the room. He didn't notice me. Not anymore. And I hated him for that. Hated the way he made me feel invisible. Hated that it took another man, another boy, to remind me that I was still a woman. At night, I replayed conversations in my head. The way Liam listened, the way he looked at me, the way he saw me in a way my husband hadn't in years. His words echoed in my mind. You're not invisible. You deserve better. You're amazing. They weren't just words anymore. They were seeds. Planted deep inside me, growing roots in places they had no business growing. And once they took hold, there was no stopping them. I hadn't done anything yet. Not really. But in my mind? In my mind, I had already crossed every line. Because the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, was that I wanted him. I wanted the way he made me feel. I wanted the way he looked at me, the way he saw me. And no matter how many times I told myself it was wrong, I didn't want it to stop. And that scared me more than anything. The next morning, I told myself I would put a stop to it. I would keep my distance. I would remind myself who I was, who he was, and that this could never happen. But then, he smiled at me across the breakfast table. And just like that, all my promises disappeared. Because when you've been starving for something long enough, the moment someone offers you a taste, you don't think about the consequences. You just take it. And I was already too far gone. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a sudden, reckless leap into the unknown. It was slow, a gradual unraveling. A series of small moments, so insignificant on their own that I could pretend they didn't mean anything. But they did. They meant everything. At first, it was just the little things. A glance held a second too long. A shared smile that felt heavier than it should. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, like he was afraid to break whatever fragile thread had started tying us together. We never spoke about it. Never acknowledged the shift. But it was there. And maybe that was the most dangerous part. Because when something remains unspoken, it has room to grow. And this? It was growing. I remember one night, standing in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. Liam walked in, grabbed a towel, and started drying the plates beside me. A simple act. But when our hands brushed, when I felt the roughness of his fingers against my skin, I didn't move away. Neither did he. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded. It was just us. The hum of the refrigerator. The soft clinking of plates. The quiet, steady rhythm of our breathing. And something unspoken hanging in the air between us, thick and undeniable. Then, David's voice, calling from the living room. The moment shattered. I pulled my hand away too quickly, almost dropping the glass in my grip. Liam exhaled sharply, stepping back. Neither of us said a word. But we didn't have to. The silence said enough. After that, everything felt different. I became hyper-aware of him. The way his shirt would ride up slightly when he stretched, revealing a sliver of skin. The way he'd lean close when he spoke, his voice a little lower, a little rougher. The way my breath would catch in my throat every time I felt him near. And the worst part? I knew he felt it too. Because sometimes I'd catch him watching me. Not in an obvious, lingering way. No, it was more subtle than that. A glance. A flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Something restrained. Something dangerous. It happened late one night. David was away on a business trip, and the house felt quieter than usual. I had been lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, half watching some old movie when Liam walked in. Couldn't sleep? I asked. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Not really. He sat down at the other end of the couch, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, even through the blanket between us. For a while, we just sat there, the flickering light from the TV casting shadows across the room. And then a shift. A simple, small movement. He reached for the remote at the same time I did. Our hands touched. And this time, Neither of us pulled away. My fingers tingled where they met his, and my breath hitched ever so slightly. His eyes flickered to mine, searching, waiting, and for one reckless second, I thought he might lean in. That I might let him. That I might close the final inch of space between us and surrender to the inevitable. But then he pulled back, cleared his throat. And just like that, the moment was gone. But it had happened. And there was no pretending it hadn't. After that night, pretending became harder. Every touch, every glance, every unspoken moment between us weighed heavier. The tension curled around us, pulling us closer, making it impossible to ignore. It was getting harder to pretend I didn't feel something stirring inside me. Harder to pretend I didn't want something to happen. Because the truth was I did. And the worst part? I knew he did too. The line between us had blurred so much it was almost invisible now. And it was only a matter of time before we crossed it completely. Some choices are made in the quiet. They don't come with warning signs or loud declarations. They happen in the moments between breaths, in the spaces where logic should step in but never does. I knew what I should do. I knew what was right. But the moment our fingers intertwined in the dark, the battle was lost. And what happened next was something I never saw coming. It started with a storm. The kind that shakes the windows, rattles the walls, and turns the night into something restless and unpredictable. David was gone again, some work trip that I barely paid attention to when he mentioned it over dinner. He had been traveling more often lately, as if the distance between us wasn't already wide enough. Liam and I were alone. It wasn't unusual. By then, we had gotten used to existing in the same space, moving around each other like two forces drawn together by something unseen, something we refused to name. I was in the kitchen when the lights flickered. A sharp crack of thunder split the sky, followed by a sudden, suffocating darkness. The power was out. I froze, gripping the counter, waiting for my eyes to adjust. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The steady noise of the TV from the living room had disappeared. Silence. Then, footsteps. Liam? My voice felt small in the pitch black. I'm here, he answered. Closer than I expected. Too close. My breath caught as I turned, and before I could react, his hand found mine. Just a touch. A steady, grounding touch. But it sent a wildfire through my veins. You're shaking, he said, his voice low, intimate in the darkness. I'm fine, I whispered. But I wasn't. I wasn't fine at all. I could feel the heat of him, the way his body hovered near mine, and in that moment, nothing else existed. Just the storm outside. Just the pulse between us. Just the way his fingers tightened around mine, as if testing, as if waiting for me to pull away. I should have stepped back, created distance, reminded him, and myself, that this was wrong. But I didn't. Because I didn't want to. Because the truth was, I had been fighting this for too long, and I was tired of pretending. So when he exhaled, his breath warm against my skin, I turned toward him. And he didn't move away. I don't know who closed the space between us first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter. All I knew was that 1 second we were standing there, breathless and waiting, and the next, his lips brushed against mine. Soft. Tentative. A question more than a demand. I could have stopped it. I could have pulled away and laughed it off, told him we were caught up in the moment, that it was nothing. But I didn't. Because it wasn't nothing. And when I kissed him back, when my fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, I knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just a moment. It was a choice. And I was making it. Guilt was already creeping in, whispering its warnings, reminding me of the ring on my finger, the life I had built, the promises I was breaking. But desire was louder. It roared in my ears, drowned out reason, swallowed every excuse I could have made. His hands were on my waist, sliding up my back, pressing me against him, and I let him. I let him. Because for the first time in years, I felt wanted. I felt needed. I felt alive. I don't know how long we stood there, tangled in each other, lost in something we couldn't undo. But then a noise. A sound from outside. A car door slamming shut. My body stiffened. Liam pulled back, his breathing uneven, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. The sound of keys jingling. The front door unlocking. And then, David's voice. "I'm home." I stepped back so fast I nearly stumbled. My pulse pounded in my ears. The heat of Liam's touch still lingered on my skin, but reality came crashing in, sharp and unforgiving. David was home. David was home. And I had just kissed his son. Liam looked at me, his chest rising and falling, his lips still slightly parted like he was about to say something, but I shook my head. A silent plea. A warning. We weren't alone anymore. The moment was over. But what we had done, that would never go away. I wish I could say that was the end of it. That the guilt swallowed me whole and I never let it happen again. But secrets don't just disappear. Desire doesn't just die. And some lines, once crossed, are impossible to uncross. When David walked through the door that night, it was like reality snapped back into place. The air that had been thick with something electric just seconds before turned suffocating, heavy with a different kind of tension. I moved first. I stepped back, yanking my hand away from Liam's, smoothing my shirt like I could erase the evidence of what had just happened. I swallowed, forcing my voice to sound normal. Casual. "Hey," I said, my throat tight. "You're home early." David tossed his keys on the counter, stretching his arms like he had just driven for hours. "Yeah, flight got canceled. Thought I'd surprise you." Surprise me. The irony of those words nearly made me laugh. Liam hadn't moved. He was still standing there, breathing a little too hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I could feel his stare burning into me, waiting for me to acknowledge him, but I couldn't. Because I knew if I did, David would see it. Maybe not the truth, not yet, but something. Something different in the way I held myself, the way my voice wavered. Something wrong. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed beside David, listening to the steady sound of his breathing, feeling the warmth of his body next to mine. It felt foreign now. Like sleeping next to a stranger. Guilt twisted in my stomach, thick and unbearable. I told myself it had been a mistake. A fleeting moment of weakness. It could never happen again. It wouldn't happen again. But the truth? I wasn't sure if I meant it. Because even as I stared at the ceiling, my mind wouldn't let go of what had happened. Liam's hands on me. The way his lips had felt against mine. The way I had wanted more. And worst of all, the way I already missed it. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had. I felt it the moment I walked into the kitchen and saw Liam sitting at the counter, his fingers drumming against the mug in front of him. He looked up the second I entered. And for a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. David was in the next room, flipping through emails on his phone, completely oblivious. But Liam and I? We were drowning in the weight of what had happened. I tore my gaze away, forcing my hands to stay steady as I reached for a glass of water. I could feel him watching me. I could feel the questions hanging between us, unspoken but loud enough to suffocate. What happens now? Do we talk about it? Pretend it never happened? Do we stop? I didn't have the answers. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. I started avoiding him. Or at least, I tried to. I busied myself with errands, stayed in my room longer, made sure there was always some kind of distance between us. But it didn't matter. Because no matter how hard I tried to bury what had happened, it wouldn't go away. It followed me in the quiet moments. When I was folding laundry and my hands froze over David's shirts, remembering the way Liam's fingers had traced the hem of mine. When I was cooking dinner and caught myself glancing toward the doorway, half expecting Liam to walk in and sit at the counter like he always did. When I lay awake at night, my skin still tingling from a touch that should have never happened. I couldn't look at him the same way. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. David wasn't an observant man. He had never been the kind of husband who noticed when I changed my hair, when I bought a new dress, when I was quietly falling apart right in front of him. But even he started to pick up on the shift. At first, it was small. A comment over dinner. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just tired." A few days later, another question. Is something going on between you and Liam? The fork nearly slipped from my hand. My heart stopped. For a second, I thought he knew. That he had seen something, felt something, put the pieces together. But then, he seems different around you, David said. Quieter. Did you guys have an argument or something? I swallowed. I shook my head. No. Everything's fine. A lie. The biggest one I had ever told. I wasn't the only one avoiding things. Liam had started to withdraw too. At first, it was subtle. He stopped lingering in the kitchen. Stopped looking at me across the room the way he used to. Stopped making those small, casual touches that had once felt so harmless. And yet, every time we passed each other in the hallway, every time our eyes met, even for the briefest second, I felt it. The tension. The pull. The thing we had tried to bury, still breathing between us. And I hated it. Because as much as I told myself this was for the best, that distance was the only thing that could save us now. I missed him. I missed the way he used to look at me. I missed the way he made me feel. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, there was one thing I knew for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. If there was, I didn't see it. Because once you've crossed that line, once you've tasted something forbidden, it doesn't just go away. It lingers. It tempts. It waits for the right moment to pull you back under. And deep down, in the part of me that I hated the most, I wasn't sure I wanted to be saved. You think this was bad? What happened next? That was when everything really fell apart. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me in ways I couldn't escape. It was in the quiet moments. When I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection, searching for the woman I used to be. When I lay beside my husband at night, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, wondering how I had gotten here, how I had let things spiral so far out of control. And worst of all, it was in the way I still felt him. Liam. Even when he wasn't near me. Even when I forced myself to act like nothing had happened. I still felt the heat of his hands. The ghost of his lips. The way he had looked at me, as if I was something worth breaking rules for. I wanted to believe it had been a mistake. A moment of weakness. That it was just about loneliness. That if David had been more present, if he had seen me the way Liam did, none of this would have happened. But the truth? The truth was harder to face. Because deep down I knew, this wasn't just about David. This wasn't just about neglect. This was about me. And the fact that I had craved something more for longer than I was willing to admit. For years, I had told myself that love changes, that passion fades, that marriages settle into something comfortable, something steady. And I had convinced myself that it was enough. But it hadn't been. Because the moment someone else had looked at me differently, had wanted me, desired me, I hadn't pushed him away. I had leaned into it. And now? Now I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that if I fell, there would be no coming back. I tried to tell myself that as long as I stopped now, as long as I kept my distance, I could still fix this. That it wasn't too late. That it was still something I could walk away from. But guilt doesn't work like that. It latches on. It digs into your skin and refuses to let go. I couldn't look at David without feeling sick. Without hearing the echo of my own betrayal in the silence between us. I couldn't sit across from Liam at the dinner table without feeling my pulse quicken, without remembering the way his lips had felt against mine. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. Not in the way I was supposed to. I regretted the risk. I regretted the mess. But I didn't regret him. And that terrified me more than anything. The thought lingered in my mind, relentless and cruel. Maybe if I told the truth, the weight of it would disappear. Maybe if I laid everything bare, if I let David see my shame, my guilt, my mistakes, I could find a way to make it right. But how do you confess something like this? How do you look your husband in the eyes and say, I kissed your son? That I had wanted it. That I had let it happen. That if the world had allowed it, I might have let it go even further. No, it wasn't possible. Because no one would understand. No one would believe that it wasn't planned. That it just happened. People love to pretend that things like this are calculated. That affairs are always premeditated. But they aren't. They creep in through the cracks, through the spaces where love should have been, through the places you never expected to find them. And by the time you realize you're in too deep, you've already drowned. The other question kept me awake at night. What if Liam told David? Not to hurt me, but because he was young. Because guilt worked differently for him. Because maybe he didn't know how to carry a secret like this without letting it spill out. Would he say something? Would he confess in some careless moment? Or worse, would he try to talk to me about it? Would he tell me he had feelings? Would I be able to stop myself if he did? Because the truth was, I had already lost control once. And if Liam wanted more, if he pulled me back in, I wasn't sure if I would be strong enough to resist. There were only two paths left. I could pretend, act like nothing had happened, avoid Liam, go back to my life, bury this secret so deep that not even I could find it again. Or I could give in. I could stop fighting what was already there and risk everything. But was there really a choice? Because if I was being honest, if I was really, truly being honest with myself, I already knew what I was going to do, and I hated myself for it. Some mistakes are easy to fix. This wasn't one of them. Because what happened next? That was when I lost control completely. Some stories are clean. They have clear villains, obvious heroes, and a resolution that ties everything up in a neat little bow. But life? Life isn't clean. It's messy. It's complicated. It's full of choices we wish we never had to make, of feelings we never meant to have. And sometimes the line between right and wrong blurs so much, you don't even realize you've crossed it until it's too late. So tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought harder to resist? Would you have shut the door, cut off the feelings before they even had the chance to take root? Or would you have done exactly what I did, let yourself fall, knowing the consequences but craving the feeling too much to care? Because here's the thing. I know I was wrong. I know what I did can't be justified. But can it be understood? That's what I want to know. That's what I need to hear from you. Because I can't be the only one who's felt this way. I can't be the only one who's looked at something forbidden and thought, just once, just one moment won't ruin everything. But one moment can. And mine? Mine was just the beginning. Have you ever been in a situation where emotions blurred the lines of right and wrong? Maybe it wasn't exactly like this. Maybe it was a best friend's partner, a coworker, someone who was off limits, but made you feel something you hadn't felt in years. Did you fight it? Did you win? Or did you let yourself give in, just once, just enough to feel alive again? Let's talk about it. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that secrets are heavier when you carry them alone. If this story hit something deep inside you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then make sure you don't miss what happens next. Because trust me, this story isn't over. Not even close. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the messy, unfiltered sides of life. Because sometimes the truth is darker than fiction. And sometimes it's even worse. Some choices stay with us forever. They don't fade. They don't disappear with time. They cling to us like shadows, silent but ever present, reminding us of the moments we wish we could take back. The moments that changed everything. This was mine. I thought I could bury it. I thought I could lock it away somewhere deep inside me and pretend it never happened. But secrets don't stay buried. They have a way of creeping back to the surface, slipping through the cracks, whispering in the quietest corners of your mind when you least expect it. And this secret? It was getting harder to carry. Because every time I looked at Liam, I felt it all over again. The way his lips had felt against mine. The way his hands had traced over my skin. The way my heart had raced in my chest, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to want. And every time I looked at David, I felt the lie settling deeper into my bones. He didn't know. Not yet. But secrets don't just destroy the people who keep them. They destroy the people they're kept from. And I was starting to wonder how much longer I could pretend. I used to think betrayal was simple. That it was something clear, something easy to define. Cheating, lying, breaking promises. But I've learned something since then. Sometimes, the worst betrayals aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that happen slowly. The ones that creep in through the spaces we never meant to leave open. The ones we don't see coming. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Because I wasn't the only one who had crossed a line. I wasn't the only one keeping a secret. I just didn't know it yet. It started small. A shift in David's behavior. A late-night phone call that ended too quickly. The way he avoided my eyes, the way his grip on his phone tightened whenever I walked into the room. And then, a receipt. Left on the nightstand, half crumpled, forgotten. A hotel. A date that didn't match his business trip. A name I didn't recognize. And suddenly, I realized. I wasn't the only one hiding something. I wasn't the only one making mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, David had seen me, all along. So now, I have to ask myself, was I really the betrayer? Or was I just playing a part in a story that had already begun before I even knew it? Had I fallen into the arms of someone forbidden out of weakness? Or had I simply recognized the truth too late, that I had already been betrayed? If you think it can't happen to you, if you think you're immune, that love is enough, that loyalty will protect you, think again. Because betrayal doesn't always come from the places we expect. And sometimes, the worst wounds aren't the ones we cause. They're the ones we never saw coming. Tell me, if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have told the truth? Would you have walked away? Or would you have kept the secret buried, knowing that some mistakes can never be undone? Some choices once made can never be taken back. And sometimes, the price of keeping a secret is realizing you were never the only one keeping one. Subscribe now for more stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature, because the truth is, we're all capable of things we never thought possible.